as being a source of information for me.
And I don't know if the two of you have seen this. There's a drama series that was on AMC, I think, called Turn, that all these events you're talking about with the Culper spy ring and these different characters, and even the submersible turtle makes an appearance in the show. Have either of you two seen that?
I have seen a number of seasons of it, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. There is a great deal of liberty taken with some of the technology that they show being employed, because some of it wasn't even invented until years after the Rev War. But the way in which they're using agents, I believe, is far truer to the historical narrative, and the agent handling, agent recruitment, trying to maintain the secrecy of the cells. I think that's quite good. And it tells a very enjoyable story.
Right. And the series is on Netflix. So listeners, if this intrigues you, I recommend you check it out about into season 3 out of 4. But I want to jump ahead a few decades and other people that you look into and their biographies as spies. One of which I'd never heard of before, and I'm very intrigued by, is Valvoline Dickinson, the doll-making spy. And I had never thought of spying on behalf of Imperial Japan in World War II, but there's no reason we wouldn't have that. So what's her story?
This lady was a spy for the Japanese, and she and her husband had gotten immersed in the Japanese community while they were living on the West Coast. And sometime in the late 1930s, they moved to New York. And from New York, they would make frequent trips back to the West Coast. This pattern was somewhat unusual because their business, that is the doll-making business, wasn't seen as particularly profitable, but they had money to constantly make these trips. What eventually it was discovered, in part through the work of the letter opening operation run by the British out of Bermuda. This lady was going to the West Coast and observing U.S. shipping, military as well as commercial operations out of the West Coast, and then reporting that through letters that ostensibly were giving details of doll sales. So this was an open code that she was using to communicate with her handlers what she was observing during these West Coast trips.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
How valuable was the intelligence that they gave, and were they ever captured during the war?
Yes, she in fact was discovered during the war. The value of the information, I can't make a definitive judgment on it. In many cases, intelligence operations are designed to acquire bits and pieces of information. Standing alone, they may not seem like of great significance, but then when put together by a strong analytical component, can in fact form, if you will, a mosaic. Each little piece of information represents a small rock, but if you put all of the rocks together in a pattern, why, you get the full picture. This is probably what Dickinson was doing in her collection.
And one other thing, the site of her doll shop at 718 Madison Street is still in place. It's now owned by Beretta Arms, which kind of an interesting use of the property. But it was, for us, it's fascinating where buildings are still in place. And we've tried to, throughout the book, call out where the original premises still stands. As if buildings could talk, it could certainly tell stories.
Scott, you mentioned this Dickinson. I think this is a point that was fascinating to me as we were doing the whole book. and that is the prominence of women in the spying operations, going into at every era that we talk about in the book. There are significant women spies who perform espionage with both daring and courage. And I guess the numbers of women that appear in our book is particularly striking to me, in the fact that, regardless of the cultural norms of the time, intelligence agencies find use for anyone who has the access and the capability to serve in that kind of a capacity.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, because that was something that my co-host and I discussed when we were mentioning the Culper spy ring in the Revolutionary War, and Anna Strong, whom you mentioned, that it wasn't just Anna Strong. I think there was also a female slave who was part of the Culper spy ring. And these figures, they're connected to powerful people, but they're overlooked or just not noticed. And people who are talking about active intelligence think, well, okay, she's a barmaid or she owns a tavern. She couldn't do anything with this information, so I'm going to be less guarded. And because they're taken for granted, these females in important places, they can have incredible intelligence that they gather. And because of this, their ability to access these different situations is what can make them such valuable assets. That's sort of what we came across. So how do you see that?
Well, I would offer that not only was that true then, but it has been true up until recent times. If you go and if you look during the height of the Cold War, Russian intelligence officers routinely dismissed the ability of women to serve as case officers. And the first female case officer we had in Moscow, Marty Peters, who ran Trigon, was very effective at first because no one thought to put her under surveillance, because someone that important, a job that important, wouldn't have been given to a woman. And certain cultures tend to dismiss women's capabilities. And I think you could see vestiges of it certainly starting back in the American Revolution and continuing at least until the 1990s. And I would say that there's still perhaps some bias in certain services even today.
I would observe that maybe at the time, in the 17, 18, 1900s, women were perhaps not as a group as willing to brag about their spy exploits as men were. And an exception to that was Pauline Cushman during the Civil War, who was a spy for the Union Army, a very successful one. She was also something of an actress, and they became a public figure. And she defies my stereotype of saying women were less willing to describe their exploits, because she wrote a biography, or contributed to a biography, that has probably the longest title of any spy book in history. It's called Life of Pauline Cushman, the Celebrated Union Spy and Scout, comprising her early history, her entry into the Secret Service of the Army of the Cumberland, and exciting adventures with the rebel chieftains and others while within the enemy lines, together with her capture and sentence to death by General Bragg, and final rescue by the Union Army under General Rosecrans. Now, there you go.
I love the old books. You don't need an explanation on the back of what it's about, because it's all right there in the title. It'll just give it away.
In this case, she did.
Okay, I didn't know her story either. What did she accomplish in the Civil War?
Well, her primary role was she was posed as one of these camp followers, and during the Civil War, the lines were very fluid, and particularly for for people who just kind of wanted to wander in and out of the various locations or encampments. If you were selling things, selling certain supplies, or you had other kind of similarly legitimate reason to be in the area, you could kind of just wander through the encampments and thereby collect quite a bit of information in terms of what the locations were, what the plans for movement were, and that sort of thing. Remember, in the Civil War era, I have a difficult time sometimes putting myself back into that time, but there was no such thing as overhead reconnaissance, and there was very little rapid communication. So knowing where the other armies were bivouacked or where their camps might have been was always a challenge for the generals on both sides of the war. Cushman was one of the people who dressed as a man and was able to infiltrate into the Confederate camps.
And Bob, and she also was very effective as posing as a Confederate camp follower, which we don't think about much these days, where we have centralized logistics that do a good job of supporting our troops. But during the Civil War, literally there was a legion of camp followers, being cooks and people who do laundry, spouses, prostitutes, that would literally follow the soldiers and help them make camp. Well, in this unofficial army of followers was fertile opportunity to gather espionage, and she fit in very nicely and was able to provide up-to-date battlefield intelligence that then could be used effectively. So once again, a woman effectively used her skills, but she also donned a Union soldier's uniform when she recounted her exploits. So being an actress certainly enabled her to be more effective in both roles.
Well, the springboard off our discussion of women as an underestimated group that were able to accomplish a lot, I'd like to focus on another underestimated group that did a lot, and that is Iowans. And as someone from my home state being Iowa, always interested in the story of George Koval, who could be looked at as a bumpkin farm boy from Sioux City, and I would argue maybe the most effective nuclear spy who ever lived. So tell us his story, and then also how he was finally found out decades and decades and decades after he did his spycraft.
We later learned that Koval's code name was Delmar. And of course, he had been born in Sioux City in 1913, very bright, went to the Mendeleev Institute of Chemical Technology in Moscow, was recruited there by Soviet military intelligence, spoke unaccented American English. He understood the culture. He played baseball, played it well, someone said. He left his wife in the USSR and returned to the U.S. around 1940, lived in the Bronx, attended classes at Columbia University, but his primary job was as the deputy resident of the secret GRU station. Now, GRU, as many of your listeners will know, is Soviet military intelligence at the time, and they operated somewhat in parallel with the NKVD, which was the predecessor of the KGB. And the GRU played a dominant role in work on the atomic bomb. And so he operated undercover at a company called Raven Electric Company at 889 Broadway. And he was the deputy resident. And they not only provided him with cover, but also helped him with a deferment that protected him from the military draft until 1943. And once he was in the Army, had an exceptionally high IQ, which eventually he was he was drawn into the top secret Manhattan Project, which gave him